I have always been a writer, a fiction writer. I think I mentioned I wrote my first book around fourth grade. It was a self-illustrated children's book about my stuffed meerkat and a sand dollar that he lost on the beach. And then even starting in high school, I would have ideas for full-length novels and I would write down a concept or start a first chapter and never really get beyond that because school takes up a lot of time. And uh so for years had started and never finished things. And then my first book was actually um historical fiction set in the Elizabethan era, about a female printer who seduces Shakespeare to get her hands on his works to print them. And that's what got me my agent. And that was very much the facet of me that was the history major at USC. That's what I specialized in terms of period of history. That was what my master's at Oxford was that era of history. And so taking a lot of that into that. And then while I was waiting to eventually find out that a publisher wasn't going to pick that up, I started writing It Happened One Fight for Fun. And I just I've always loved that era of Hollywood history. I was soaked in it working in an archive, and the classes that I chose at USC when I had elective choice were always from that golden age of Hollywood. And and so I had wanted to write something in that space for a while. And then the idea actually came from I interviewed Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves several years ago when they made a rom-com called Destination Wedding. And that was actually the interview in which Winona just announced that she and Keanu were married for real on the set of Dracula, which of course made headlines and people are still talking about to this day. But then I got to thinking, like, that sounds like the plot of a rom-com. Like, what would happen if actors were accidentally married on set? And then immediately went to what would be a lot more interesting if they didn't like each other. So, um, and that was sort of the nugget that got me going. And then also thinking, hey, I've always wanted to write in this old Hollywood space. It's what I know, it's what I love. Also, it would be a much bigger problem to deal with in this time when it was a lot harder to get a divorce. Definitely one of my favorite things in writing both It Happened One Fight and His Girl Hollywood is finding opportunities to bring in as much of the real history as possible, be it fictionalizing it and relating it to my characters or actually putting them in the real places of that era. Like in all of my books, they go to nightclubs and bars and restaurants that were real of that time and did lots of research to make it as accurate as possible. Very few of them still exist, at least in the way that they did then. So really getting to shine a light on these places because I think Hollywood was such a community and a destination at that time in a way that it is not now. It's so much more a concept now than it is a place. And it was both at that time, and the place fed the concept and created the concept. And so getting to litter my books with the things that built our notion of Hollywood is really fun. And also, I think people tend to think of those movies as like packed in mothballs or very old-fashioned, and they were humans just like us with foibles and temptations and uh, you know capacity for making good and bad decisions. And just because the production code necessitated a certain version of life in these films doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of interesting stuff happening behind the scenes. And so that was very important to me to illustrate in my book. And then I find it really interesting what you said about a certain type of person or the type of people that are in the industry or that live here. And a big part of my books, but especially my first book, It Happened One Fight, is about kind of that public image and that persona, because especially at that time, you didn't necessarily even have control over what that was. The studio dictated what it was, and it might be completely different from who you were as a real person. And so a lot of the book is about, being able to be your true self and the gap between that public mask and who you really are, and how that impacts your relationships and the people you fall in love with and what you think of someone versus who they really are. Um, and I definitely think that's still a truism today, but it's so pointed and easy to unpack when you have something like the studio system that was so draconian and dictating these people's lives in a way that studios do not today. With all of my female characters, really digging into the abuses and the subtle or unsubtle sexism that they're confronted with in their careers, because their options were so much more limited. And I would say probably my studio boss is a little idealized, but there are certainly a lot of characters and situations in the book that confront that head on. And I think it's really important to do so because, we have some stories, we have things like the life of Judy Garland to illustrate the kind of tyranny and abuse that these people were subjected to and really couldn't do anything about because they would have no career and no income. Um, but there is no way for us to have a reckoning in the way that we've had with some of these figures from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, because these people are gone and there's not a lot of records necessarily of these things. And so, and it was even more taboo then for you to complain or talk about these things. And um I really want to give voice to a lot of that, even if we don't have concrete evidence of what happened, because, for everyone who's spoken out now as part of the Me Too movement, I can't imagine how many women were working in Hollywood in this era who had similar stories or worse, who never got to tell their truth.